Some days call for working up a sweat, working on your passion, and endless action. Ditch the glitch with Liquid IV's new Energy Multiplier Sugar-Free. Refreshing flavors like strawberry kiwi and blackberry lemonade. Scientifically formulated to support physical energy, hydration, focus, mood, and social stamina. Liquid IV's new Energy Multiplier Sugar-Free. Hydrating energy. Tap the banner to learn more.
It's rare for us to have an episode with so many feces mentioned right off the top, but do not worry, refreshments will be served. Hello and welcome to Doomsday, history's most dangerous podcast. Together, we are going to rediscover some of the most traumatic, bizarre, and awe-inspiring but largely unheard of or forgotten disasters from throughout human history and around the world. On today's episode, we're doing another one-of-a-kind here, and I'll explain the rules as we get into it, but for all those listeners who love our more unhygienic content, well, have we got a treat for you. We're talking about the only consumer product you can blow out your nose while friends and strangers cheer you on. We'll discuss more context and uses for plop than you could possibly shake a feces-coated stick at, and we'll see why the only thing that you cannot kill about the British in countless and ghoulish ways is their spirit. And if you were listening to this on Patreon, there is only one extra segment in this episode. However, it will definitely be different. I will be providing some Dodge Caravan math, but I will be belching the entire thing for you on a dare from my family. This is not the show you play around kids or while eating or even in mixed company. But as long as you find yourself a little more historically engaged and learn something that could potentially save your life, our work is done. So, with all that said, shoo the kids out of the room, put on your headphones and safety glasses, and let's begin. Back in the day, 9,000 years ago, when saber-tooth and woolly animals still roamed the Great Plains, at a time when our first upright walking ancestors first lifted a rotting fermented fruit to their lips and choked it down, alcohol has been humanity's constant companion. It's been used in rituals and medicine and trade for thousands of years. I've heard it described as humanity's earliest and most enduring biochemical experiment. And as rotting fruit transformed into wines and meads and early grain beers, it evolved alongside us and we evolved alongside it. It became one of our greatest social ills and one of our favorite party treats. Whether you sip it, brew it, or blow it out your nose in the form of vomit while friends and strangers cheer you on, the majority of people around the world will imbibe alcohol at least once in their life. Some for the rest of their lives, some just until it kills them. Alcohol does kill roughly 3 million people a year. For comparison, sharks kill about 6 people, and vending machines, they kill closer to 13. By the numbers, take every person who died from every cause under the sun in a year, from plane crashes to lawnmower accidents to choking on a hot dog, even having your head removed by a logging truck. Take all of it, add it all up, and in the grand calculus of death, alcohol alone kills about 5% of everybody. Time was when a product like that had to have a little skull on the label. Whether it simply poisons your blood or rots your liver or leads you to run yourself over with your own car, there are lots of options. And you'll notice there are no drinking songs about making good choices. Getting crunked could lead you to a Waffle House at 3 a.m. with some kind of vague grudge and bleary eyesight. And I remind you, there are no end of enthusiastic future death row inmates who also enjoy a drink or two, willing to oblige your behavior with the broken end of a wine, whiskey, or beer bottle. either of which will fit nicely into your neck and or chest. Case in point, at the oldest pub in Toronto here, there once worked a bartender with a cast that ran from her fingers to her elbow. She told me she got it from punching a customer who patted her on the bum until she had broken most of her bones without realizing it. The point was, she was as drunk as the man that she murdered. No one ever talks about your booze-initiated heart disease or various cancers, just cirrhosis, alcohol's poster child. And you may be asking yourself why anyone drinks. Well, have you ever yelled chug to the point that it doesn't sound like a word anymore? If so, you know how booze can turn things that, on paper, aren't that interesting into the funniest thing ever. It's part of its charm, and you may be thinking, you're damned right it is. But, and this is a point, you can achieve the identical net effect by simply starving your brain of oxygen by huffing solvents. I stopped drinking years ago. It was a simple choice. Just in my experience, alcohol always takes away more than it gives. But this is not going to be an episode about abstinence or the evils of alcohol, so have no fear. No. Today's episode will be all about death and destruction. Alcohol will simply be the star of today's show. But let me take alcohol side here for just a second before we begin and say it wasn't alcohol's fault. You'll just have to wait and see. Now, as ideas go, what we are about to do here would be considered in poor taste for a true crime podcast. It might even be for a negligent homicide podcast. But because of the nature of our program, we are about to dive into a very special, one-of-a-kind, first ever in podcast broadcast history episode. Welcome to our first ever historical disaster drinking game-isode. And I should lay down some ground rules. For one, every time I say something gross related to human filth in any capacity, you take a sip. Sorry, let me clarify, I know that sounds bad. I am specifically referring to feces, bodily fluids, and various corpse juices. That also includes animals. And I say sip because otherwise you're gonna get slotted into that 5% that we just talked about. This is going to be a challenging enough episode as it is. To begin our adventure today, and to get your mind off of all of that, we will be enjoying a pint of matured porter. It's an ancestor of modern stouts. Basically, just think of Guinness, or anything dark brown to the point of almost black from the British Isles. And I hope you brought your smile, because my promise for this episode is you're not going to see another one for a while. Welcome to St. Giles in central London, England in the early autumn of 1814. Ooh, you say, 1800s England. I've never been. It sounds positively regal. Well, let me stop you right there. When I started researching, was St. Giles considered worse than other localities? It kept auto-correcting localities to slums. And we have talked about the reality of 1800s London before. They are quite literally some of our grossest episodes, which is saying a lot. Remember all those people who got bathed in the rotting bacteria-laden gore of an exploding horse corpse? Of all of the dank, soap-avoidant areas of Victorian London competing for the grim title of worst living conditions, well, okay, there was Bethnal Green. That was one of London's poorest areas. But then there was Clerkenwell, which was the pickpocket-ridden setting for Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist. Then there was Whitechapel, which was known for its crushing poverty way before Jack the Ripper moved in with his property values, schmopperty values mentality. And well, of all of the pockets of 1800s English hell the greater London area had to offer, St. Giles wore a fly-coated tin or pewter crown. St. Giles was a squalid, dilapidated labyrinth of extremely overcrowded and crumbling tenement buildings. Common, single-room lodging houses and illegal cellar dwellers were crammed to the rafters with hobos and beggars and criminals and thieves and barefoot children and old-timey prostitutes that did not know the gentle caress of soap And ew, gross, the Irish. Picture a scene so thick with chimney smoke that it looked and smelled like it was on fire. On any given day, it might smell like chemical fumes or tar vapor or just the dust from old horse feces. It's the kind of place no one speaks kindly of, and even less people would visit willingly. One contemporary said the entire neighborhood was buried in smoke and wretchedness. Everything smelled like old beer and boiled cabbage and every other stink humanity is capable of producing, and all of it lit by the thin flicker of oil lamps. Now, London proper, like downtown fancy London, was having a heyday. The Napoleonic Wars were just wrapping up. Wealthy people strolled Regent Street in their finest laces. Philosophers debated the future of man and sipped cognac in smoky lecture halls, while all the while, the barely toothed people of St. Giles lived hand to mouth, meaning sometimes they chewed on their own hands out of hunger, like a chocolate bar. Kids as young as 6 worked 10-hour days in factories, and the life expectancy was only 35. Of course it was. You should have seen what they drank. It came from the Thames River, where sewage and dead animals and industrial runoff and human waste clotted and ran through open drains along the streets on its way into the Thames. Indoor plumbing was virtually non-existent at the time, and a dozen families might share the same overflowing outdoor toilet, said in quotes, and left in the sun, these would bake into something with the reek of hot ammonia and sour whiz. And more to the point, in poorer areas like we're in, drinking water often came from shallow wells or public pumps dug right beside cesspools or graveyards or slaughterhouses. Water from a local tap or well might vaguely smell of rust and sewage and might come with a little green film of algae on top. Urban graveyards were often overfilled by the mid-century, and some were known to leak or seep into adjoining wells. Medical officers of the time did report that cloudy well water was sometimes visible with organic matter. They kept using the word putrefaction. Okay, maybe pause the show for an hour or two at this point and kinda sober up a bit before continuing. That was an awful lot that we just went through. Okay, now that you're all back, the one-stop shop for most people's aquatic and hydration needs was the Thames River, like we said. We also said it was the final destination for thousands of cesspits and drains and sewers discharging untreated filth. Someone might hard defecate the most foul choleric diarrhea into the river while only a few feet away, someone shrugs, finishes their bath, and fills their mug. There were tales of the surface becoming so thick with human spackle that a person could walk across it. Do you have any idea how long a condition this bad has to exist before all living memory of what water used to look like is dead and gone? Cholera was so virulent and the bring out your dead cart guys were so busy that people often died halfway through filling out their wills and just kinda lay indoors for days at a time before they could be removed. Coffins often sat in homes or alleyways, and sometimes they leaked bodily fluids and decay. And I remind you, air conditioning, for what it was worth in England, was still 120 years away. Everything was awful, and if you still romanticize the era, let me tell you, if you met Jane Eyre in real life, you would uncontrollably and unapologetically shove her away from you while physically gagging from the smell coming off her. I said a lot of awful things about alcohol to kick off this episode, and then I went and ruined drinking water, so the safest bet for us is to actually go back to alcohol. For one, boiling the water during brewing kills a lot of pathogens and bacteria. And the fermentation process that produces the alcohol is an even more potent germ killer. And another big part that you wouldn't think about because you live in the modern era is because beer was produced in sealed equipment and then stored immediately in casks and barrels, it was safe from any random member of the public just casually throwing up into it or dipping their germ-soaked genitals into it. Beer was just a cleaner and safer option in an overcrowded and life-infested city that didn't quite yet understand what sick make not people so good feel. To really belay the point, this was an era where you could easily have a chamber pot filled with fetid brown liquid thrown in your face at any moment and from any direction. Serving up some much-needed hydration and libation after a long day of coughing on things or sawing up old dead horses stood the Horseshoe Brewery. It towered over the back streets of St. Giles, taking up an entire city block, looming over the corner of Tottenham Court Road and Great Russell Street, and it ran along Bainbridge and New Streets, pressing right up against the St. Giles Rookery. The Rookery was a slum of cramped dwellings built over cellars. The brewery was founded in 1864 and basically took the name from the tavern that it had paved over, which had existed on the same spot since 1623. By the mid-1780s, the brewery was pumping out 40,000 barrels of porter a year, and a few years before we got here, in 1809, the operation had been bought up by the family of Henry Mew. They did okay for themselves. As families go, they were fairly close to the top of London's upper crust. How could they not be? They'd cornered the market on a public alternative to diarrheaing yourself to death. And I'm not saying all the land and titles and high society influence went to their heads and made them eccentric weirdos, but Lady Valerie Mew once scandalized polite society by having her carriage pulled by zebras, so you tell me. By 1811, they'd revamped the brewery into a complex industrial operation that brewed almost an unheard of 100,000 barrels of beer in a year. And some of the vats that held that beer were larger than houses. These were the biggest in the world, and some were over 200 years old. So they held more than they leaked, but they definitely leaked. The largest was 22 feet or almost 6.5 meters tall and over 60 feet or 18 meters across. That is about the size of a 2-story building and as wide as 4 Dodge Caravans parked end to end. A vat that size would hold around 163,000 gallons or 740,000 liters and was held together by 30 massive iron hoops. Okay, Patreons, I am about to do some Dodge Caravan math, as advertised. However, I am also going to try to burp the entire thing on a dare from my family. I am going to try to keep this short so I do not make myself sick, and if you yourself don't want to feel sick listening to it, just skip ahead about 30 seconds.
So, the original vat held over 3,500 barrels of fermenting porter. That's over 320,000 pints. The Dodge Caravan could hold about 158 feet of storage. 1 square foot can hold 50 pints. Thus, a Dodge Caravan could hold about 7,900 pints. That's 40 Dodge Caravans. It takes 5 minutes to enjoy a bite without throwing up. That's about 3 years of non-stop chugging and belching.
No joke, that was the hardest thing I've ever recorded. That took 5 days. The brewery had as many as a dozen different vats on the go at the same time. The whole neighborhood smelled kinda sour, like yeasty beer because of it. So, what did it taste like? Well, I've heard it described as having the deep toasty flavor of burnt bread crust, with dark molasses, roasted nuts, and a touch of earthy bitterness from the English hops. And after months of aging away in barrels, it would pick up a faint woody sharpness. And people describe the mouthfeel, yep, that's a term, as bready almost to the point of being chewy. I can't help but feel like this was the stuff you got down and kept down, mostly just to fill your stomach.
No joke.
And if you grew up listening to commercials for beers made out of glacier fresh spring water, You might start to make a face when you consider the beer brewed at the Horseshoe was basically made from boiled urine with the occasional pube or bone fleck strained out of it. I mean, boiling diaper water can only do so much. So this wasn't exactly a delicate sipping beverage, although it kinda was. Everything I've said so far aside, Muse was respected enough to find in upscale taverns and gentlemen's clubs. Back then, beer wasn't branded for consumer recognition the way modern lagers are today. You wouldn't specifically order a glass of Triple Fart or Runoff Light. You'd order a pint of Muse Porter or Muse Stout. It was a robust, hearty, thick, and smoky brew, rich and full-bodied. And surprisingly consistent, depending on how much your drinking hole of choice watered theirs down. Today, most beers sit around 5% alcohol by volume. This stuff sat somewhere closer to 7 and possibly as high as 9%. Strong enough to help one forget those cold English nights, and if you took enough, maybe it'd make you forget that you live in a Victorian slum. Our story today takes place October the 17th, 1814. And the day started like any other. Everything was gross. Merchants peddled cabbage and fish. Flower girls and bootblacks and chimney sweeps whistled their happy working songs, while children played in the feces-soaked gutters, daring each other to get run over by horse-drawn carriages. Entertainment was in short supply, but the whole thing had a little Mary Poppins-like charm to it, except everyone had cholera, and their outfits were caked with dried human waste, and absolutely no one was singing about anything. Chimney sweeps only whistled while they worked to blow the stink out of their faces. Also, on topic, toothpaste as we know it was still at least a half-century away. The brewing vats were held together with massive iron hoops, each weighing several hundred pounds, like we said. Well, today, around 4:30, a clerk named George Crick noticed something was off, literally. He noticed that one of the heavy iron rings on one of the vats had been slipping. This was the kind of thing that had happened before, and everyone knew it posed no immediate danger, but he reported it all the same. I often tell people about the distinction between what you know, what you don't know, and what you don't even know that you don't know. And in this case, what they didn't know was that 680 tons of beer was pressing equally against all sides of the vat from within, on constant readiness to take advantage of the smallest failure to reveal itself and relieve some of that pressure, like a balloon waiting for a pinprick. It pressed outward, silently, watching patiently, feeling out the iron ring as it slipped a little bit at a time. Vats always creaked, but a shudder passed through this one, almost like a groan. Workers paused to listen, but nothing. What they didn't know that they didn't know was that they were in grave danger. George Crick just finished up quilling off a letter about it to one of the operating partners when from out of nowhere a rivet screamed loose, followed by another and another, as the oak panels of the vat, now swollen and trembling, split apart and unleashed with a thunderous crack that echoed across the entire neighborhood. The massive wooden structure exploded with intense force, and in an instant, a surge of beer 15 feet high and black as tar thundered through the brewhouse, sweeping away heavy timbers like driftwood. This triggered a chain reaction, as the shock and pressure of it all destroyed nearby vats and hundreds of stacked barrels, adding to the chaos. Debris from the explosion landed on rooftops several streets over. The roof of the brewery itself buckled. Beams and joists smashed into each other, and in moments, a wave of beer and debris acting like a battering ram punched through brick and mortar as the back wall of the brewhouse collapsed outward. The two closest houses were almost immediately and completely demolished. Eleanor Cooper had been a barmaid at the Tavistock Arms before she was crushed flat between the weight of a collapsing stone wall. She was only 14. The liquid tore through homes, smashed fences, and surged into filling low-lying cellars where the poorest lived right up to the rafters, forcing terrified inhabitants to scramble to stay above it. Whole rooms crumpled inward, trapping families beneath their furniture and the torrent of brew. Residents screamed as the liquid burst through their doors without warning and drowned them where they sat. In one house, Mary Banfeld and her 4-year-old daughter Hannah were having a lovely spot of tea, and then they drowned. In another, an Irish family had gathered to mourn a deceased toddler and found themselves quickly joining her in the afterlife. All were drowned and swept away. For the beer, this was its first time outside, and it wanted to see the big city. New Street was the first to be hit. Children playing nearby were immediately swept away and swallowed by the dark, thunderous, unstoppable, roaring, frothing 15-foot-tall high wave that roared through the streets and alleyways. Cellar dwellings were instantly swamped, like we said, and a lot of these things were already prone to flooding even in just moderate rain. The force of the liquid reduced homes to rubble, crumbling under the impact, while others were left buckled and cracked. In a matter of minutes, at least 8 neighborhood residents had been drowned and or crushed beneath the collapsing masonry. Probably both, really. In total, 8 people died. Most of them were women and children. They had no chance against the power of the Black Tsunami, that's what people called it. Neighbors began digging through the rubble and mud immediately. Others, though, and this is where it gets a little gross again, imagine finding a pint of free beer, and you chug it, and then you kind of fish half of a ring finger or a children's ponytail out of your mouth. You familiar with the phrase, waste not, want not? Well, residents were dazed but compelled to grab whatever they could to collect as much free beer as they could. Teacups, kettles, pots, bottles, bedpans, even their hats. But one man did use his child repeatedly as a kind of a vacuum to hoover up as much as he could hold in his little mouth before racing him home to spit it out into a wash basin. I'm thinking it's the same kind of impulse that had people collecting pieces of the space shuttle after it exploded, knowing full well that they were mildly radioactive. Now, I don't want to create the impression that everyone was immediately pushing each other out of the way to dive in mouth first. That wasn't really the scene. People were extremely well behaved. There were no drunken fistfights and nobody rioted, nobody looted. To all accounts, unimaginable horror aside, everyone remained very composed and well behaved. Now, here's the thing about free street beer in 1800s England. A friend once taught me that if you have a barrel of feces and you add a drop of wine, you still have a barrel of feces. Where if you take a barrel of wine and add a single drop of feces, you now have 2 barrels of feces. It doesn't take much to ruin a thing was the takeaway of the story, and every square inch of London was caked in a semi-opaque coat of shit going back centuries. Crowds were drawn in either by grief for what just happened or simple curiosity. Some watchmen began actually charging a small entrance fee so you could go and visit the smashed brewhouse. And bodies were, of course, laid out in the grim Victorian custom of public viewing, and this, of course, was free. There were accounts of people dying from alcohol poisoning, but nothing that I could really prove, so I chalk all that up to just exaggerated reporting to sell newspapers. Before too long, the Horseshoe Brewery recovered and continued operations. But they had to reset the sign counting the number of days since their last workplace safety incident back to 0, and the residents of St. Giles slowly got back to drowning in debt instead of alcohol. Today, the London beer flood of 1814 is often told with a smirk, just a curious little historical oddity. It was just another bizarre incident in a city with a long, strange history. Case in point, not that long before this, a creep named the London Monster had been running around town stabbing ladies in their buttocks. So, like I said, there was always something strange to be had. For the families and survivors, they learned that you don't have to work in an industrial plant to be killed by it. And like all major cities, with time, creepy alleyways and hovels were paved over with condos, and the slums became a little more than a memory. So, you're listening to a podcast talk about poop and alcohol, and you're drinking right along with it, and the host keeps telling you to sip and preaching sensibility, but you're all, shut up, you don't know me, I'll do what I want. and you're not make so think so good anymore, and hopefully someone else is there with you listening to this, and do you know what the paramedics will probably do? That's right. Step 1. Don't even wait to hear the rest of this. Just get 911 on the horn and call a professional. A lot of people don't know that alcohol can poison you, and it's easier than you think. It happened to me once. Our bodies are designed to filter alcohol through our livers and survive our appetite for it, but it can be toxic in large amounts, and when I said poisoned, I really meant kill. People get so drunk they think they're the life of the party, but in fact they are a medical emergency currently urinating into a pile of coats on your bed, which they have collapsed on unconsciously, and their pants are still on. Basically, you can totally poison yourself by drinking too fast. When you consume a toxic amount of alcohol in too short of a period of time, you overwhelm your body's ability to even process it. And alcohol is a central nervous system depressant, so it can slow down your breathing and your heart rate and your body temperature to dangerous levels. As a rule of thumb, your liver can tackle about 1 drink an hour. Everything above and beyond that has nowhere to go and just parks itself in your bloodstream, and when your blood alcohol content rises too high, let's skip down the path of consequences. Confusion, stupor, loss of consciousness, seizures, dangerously slow or irregular breathing, a low body temperature approaching hypothermia, the risk of choking on your own vomit, and don't laugh, I know someone that happened to. Then there's coma, and of course, death. I dated a girl named Mary in high school, and she took care of me after I overdid it in her kitchen one night, and I tried climbing out her window. She saved my life, and if I ever had the opportunity to speak to her again in this life, I'd apologize for our entire relationship, but more specifically for puking on her bed, which soaked into her mattress. Alcohol in the body shuts down the systems that keep you alive. So, how do you know when it's serious? If someone is confused, they won't wake up or they can't stay conscious. If they're breathing slowly or irregularly. If their skin starts to feel cold or look bluish at all, and of course the vomiting, well, here's what you do. You call emergency services. You just do it right away. You are on a clock, and while you are waiting for them to arrive, you want to roll the person onto their side with their head slightly tilted downward. It's called the recovery position, and its whole point is really just to make sure they don't choke if they throw up. Never put them on their backs. Keep them warm and stay with them. They don't need coffee, they're not going to be able to walk this off, and you cannot stop the damage by trying to make them throw up. It's all in their bloodstream, and it has to work its way through. Literally, the only cure is time. There's nothing you can do to make a liver work faster. So your job is to keep them alive until the alcohol is metabolized. And because of the nature of how it works, it's probably actually getting worse inside while you're sitting there watching them. And that is why we call for help. You're not going to be running intravenous saline to maintain their blood pressure or intubating their throat to clear their airway if needed. You don't even have an EKG machine to monitor their heart rate or the know-how to spot the signs that this is turning into a whole neurological emergency that threatens their brain. You can't just push bread in their mouth and hope it'll soak some of it up. The only cure is time and watching them closely. And medical intervention. Just gotta say that again. The keys to their survival? I was gonna say start with you, but really, they start an ambulance. This is as good a time as any to please check yourself and make sure you can still count your fingers, or legibly pronounce your own name before continuing. Take a day or two if needed. That's the beauty of not doing this show live. We're not going anywhere. Alright, now that everyone has hit play again, without further ado, welcome to part 2. We are going to travel roughly 290 miles or 470 kilometers in a straight line west-northwest across the Irish Sea to a little place called, you guessed it, Ireland. The Emerald Isle, the old country, the land of saints and scholars. Today, we'll be visiting the capital of the Republic of Ireland, Dublin. And when people tend to think of Dublin and Ireland in general, they tend to think of rolling green hills and poor weather and shamrocks. Probably because they are not thinking of it in terms of 1875 Dublin. Specifically today, we will be visiting the Liberties District. The Liberties was a neighborhood just southwest of the city centre, near Christchurch and St. Patrick's Cathedrals, if that helps. At the time, to understand the people, take what I told you about London picturing another densely packed neighborhood filled with narrow streets, except this time, instead of the indigent and Morlocks, it was filled with poor working class people. Then turn down the mad screaming and pump up the stomach noises, and yeah, you're starting to get it. Everything from textile workers to cobblers to fishmongers all made home among the workshops and tanneries and distilleries. Money was tight in the area, and families squeezed into dark, crumbling tenements, saying grace over a bisected piece of bread, while the children make art from the mold on the walls to entertain their only friends, the plague rats, before they blew out their only candle and as many as 10 to 12 people climbed onto a single mattress filled with straw. If these people saw you sleeping on a sofa, they would think that you were rich as f***. There are stories of people who slept standing up. The overcrowding was relentless and the accommodations were underwhelming. The streets were lined with open drains and stagnant water, which made cholera and typhus and smallpox very popular. Poverty was on display, yes, but from this kind of hardship comes simple human warmth. Kids playing in the streets, adults trading stories and sharing a laugh over washing lines or pub tables. You know how when you impersonate Irish people, you always go tar-ta-tar-ta-tar? That is because we all believe that the Irish have a song in their hearts. That said, in 1870, the effects of the Irish famine were still in full effect. Let me put it like this. A popular activity for new parents was to pray that they would see their second birthday. So, desperate people from the country made their way into the cities in search of work. If they were lucky, they might land a job hauling carts through the narrow streets, or laboring on the docks or in the distilleries. Women might be able to bring in a few pennies a day doing freelance laundry or seamstress work, while their barefoot, hollow-eyed children were sent out to sell matches or whatever people were willing to pay them for. Imagine doing all of this with only a pot of weak tea and a little bit of bread to carry you over for the day. And I said that most people think of Green Hills or Shamrocks or Bono, but let's be honest, when most people think of Ireland, they're thinking of booze. Whiskey has famously been a part of Ireland's history for well over 1,000 years. They call it the water of life, and they've been making it since at least the 1100s. The word whiskey itself comes from the Gaelic term Ishkabaha. Go ahead, ask me how you get whiskey from Ishkabaha. Do you have any idea how drunk you have to be to try and pronounce whiskey and say Ishkabaha? The earliest written mention of it was in the Annals of Clonmacnoise from 1405. Magranel, chieftain of Montyrolis, drank himself to death over Christmas. It's a hard time of year for a lot of people. It is believed that Moorish alchemists taught medieval Irish monks how to distill it, and that was that. By the mid-1800s, there were breweries and distilleries across Dublin. Their whiskey industry was booming, and if they recorded gross domestic product back then, by the best estimates, whiskey would have counted for about 87%. By the 1800s, Irish whiskey was the most popular in the world, with Scotland as a very close second. And that was only because Ireland just edged out Scotland for the earliest recorded mention of the stuff. The Liberties were home to many large and pretty famous brewers and distilleries like Guinness and Jameson. Livestock was also common in the city at this time, so you can think of it as the smelly industrial heart of Dublin. This part of the story takes place June the 18th, 1875, 60 years after Part 1. Dublin wasn't as bad as London, but it was still part of the United Kingdom, and this was 150 years ago. The first licensed distillery in the world was in Ireland, opened in 1608 by none other than King James I, a man who hated witches but loved getting crunked. Irish whiskey was produced in a pot still, which looks vaguely like a windswept genie's lamp. It took malted and unmalted barley and turned it into smoky liquid amber warmth. From there, the liquid sat in barrels maturing in warehouses across the city. It was aged in special wooden casks or barrels for years until it finally achieved a smokier and spicier taste. There were at least 4 major distilleries in the local area and thousands of illegal ones, but that's a different story. Among them stood the Malone's Bonded Warehouse on Chambers Street, owned by the big shots at DWD, that's the Dublin Whiskey Distillery. Malone's Bonded Warehouse and Reed's Malthouse stood at the corner of Chamber and RD Streets. And aging away in this warehouse sat more than 300,000 gallons of whiskey sitting in about 5,000 large wooden casks, which back then they called hogsheads. And if you don't do gallons, that was about 1.2 million liters. They warehoused product from several different distilleries, and the air inside smelled faintly sweet from all of the evaporating alcohol. On this day, around 4:45, everything was all finished for the day and everyone had all gone home, except for one excise officer who checked the malthouse and the warehouse before locking up for the night. It wasn't exactly a Mission Impossible bunker. They basically worried more about the cask count and people disobeying the "Don't Steal Barrels" sign that was over the door. Whiskey casks were stacked, sometimes several barrels high, in fairly tight quarters with little ventilation, and the warehouse promises that they'll keep your stuff safe without you having to worry about people dipping their genitals in it for no reason. All was in order, and the world just kept ticking along, leaving it be to age quietly in peace. Until about 8 o'clock that night. With all the hearths and fireplaces and ovens and kilns and industrial chimneys in the area, smoke was ever present. But this was different. This had a mixed aroma. It had a sharp medicinal smell that stung the nose. It was kind of a sweet burnt toffee kind of a scent, and they described it as an overpowering spirituous vapor, so heavy that it made people cough and even stagger. All eyes spun to the warehouse just in time to see a powerful column of blue flame breaking through the roof and shooting 30 feet in the air. There hadn't been anyone inside the warehouse to bear witness or call an alarm up till now, and possibly prevent what happened next. It could have been spontaneous combustion or human error, but it really didn't matter at this moment. By 8:30, alarms were ringing, and everyone from fire crews to police to soldiers to gawkers were pulling up their galoshes and running to the scene. A bonded warehouse was built to be solid and secure and, in theory, fireproof. They were constructed with thick masonry brick and stone walls. Thing is, being fireproof from the outside meant that the warehouse itself became an unintentional heat-retaining structure on the inside. A massive sealed oven chamber, if you will. And all that heat had nowhere to go, so it just radiated back inwards on its own contents, roasting the barrels like an early Christmas ham. It acted like a heat trap and burned much hotter than a traditional vented wooden structure. Now, the barrels were designed to prevent vapor from escaping, which trapped the expanding pressure created inside as the liquid heated and expanded to the point where it overpowered the barrel's ability to hold itself together. And once that first cask burst, neighboring barrels quickly began to fail, like dominoes. Bottled whiskey meant for retail is diluted down to a lower alcohol content, but the whiskey in these casks was undiluted, high-proof, and highly combustible. The floor became a pool of flaming liquid, building by the minute as more and more whiskey burst free. All that liquid and vapor turned the oven-like effect into a blast furnace, which only accelerated the destruction inside. The room likely hit about 1,000 degrees Celsius or 1,800 Fahrenheit, but the hottest parts of the flaming ethanol could have topped 2,000 degrees Celsius or 3,700 Fahrenheit. And of course, liquid is a slave to gravity, and it constantly sought out any available exits it could seep through, under doors or through cracks in the building, whatever wasn't airtight. The first visible exit was a low windowsill, and the moment that blue-orange liquid of ribbon flame cascaded over the sill onto the street and met with all that fresh air, everything kicked into a much higher gear as the inferno mixed with real oxygen for the first time. The sound of hot gases escaping while oxygen tried to rush in would have been as loud as a turbine, and as windows and doors failed, each added to the number of points of exchange. When all 15 members of the Dublin Fire Brigade arrived on the scene, they were completely overwhelmed. They knew they were in trouble, and you remember all the police and soldiers arriving at the Cook County Assessor's office at the end of the Blues Brothers movie? Well, that is what they called on to help them control the blaze. There was more than enough liquid inside the warehouse to create a sustained flowing waterfall, and onlookers gasped. You expect smoke and flames and, maybe if you're lucky, a little crumbling of the walls. You do not expect a half-foot deep river of burning alcohol. Ribbons of blue flame wove down through the steep, narrow cobbled stones of the streets, and it must have been mesmerizing. Flames ran down the gutters, igniting whatever it could. The liquid burned blue, but added yellow and orange highlights wherever it came into contact with other non-liquid burnables. The crackle of a warm fire and the oohs and ahs of the growing crowds of onlookers did not inspire concern, but as gravity carried the flaming river downhill towards Chamber Street and New Street on its way, it spread to wooden stables and pig pens, and nothing disinvites curiosity like the collective screaming of horses and pigs and goats and chickens. That is all many residents needed to hear before evacuating. And it is a credit to those who ran towards the danger to free what animals that they could. Not everyone left voluntarily, of course. Police constables hauled terrified families from their cramped rooms and tossed them into the street with the simple instruction to run where the fire wasn't. There wasn't a panic, but there was a lot of shouting and coughing. The Dublin Fire Brigade, police, and soldiers scrambled to keep the flames from spreading to nearby buildings, many of which were packed with their own uniquely flammable wares. Captain James Robert Ingram was in charge of the scene, and they were lucky to have him. He knew that water was only going to spread the flames further. As it was, the flow measured only 2 feet wide by 6 inches deep, but stretched for more than 400 meters down one side of Mill Street. That is about 82 Dodge Caravans long. Captain Ingram had his men try to dam the flow by ripping up the roads and creating sand barriers, but it still seeped through. Then he had an inspiration. If you've been listening to this episode long enough, what is the one thing coating every surface of Victorian life that they had in abundance to work with? Manure. They used bio-waste from nearby tanneries and the abundant animal feces laying around to slap up a barrier by hand, the way Richard Dreyfuss made his mashed potato art in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And to skip by an awful lot of work, the fire was extinguished and dead by 4 a.m. the next morning. You know what else was dead by 4 a.m.? Okay, before we get into it, let me say that compared to London, Dublin at least had a partial sewer system. They did not have 11,000 open-faced fecal flume rides sluicing down into their water source. 1870s Dublin was maybe 30 to 50% cleaner than 1810s London. That said, the streets were still stained with mud, horse plop, vomit, and other objectionables, and cholera was still a thing, of course. In spite of the fact that flames connecting to businesses and homes along the way resulting in hugely destructive fires that brought down walls and hollowed out buildings, the novelty of a flaming river of free alcohol drew the crowds all right. People scooped it up in anything they could find. Hats, tins, baby bassinets. A reporter from the Irish Times nearly hurled when he saw men taking off their stinking boots and using them as drinking cups. They were just trying to salvage what they could from this hot mess. People just cupped their hands and raw-dogged the literal firewater right out of the feces-lined trenches that it traced. It would have been like going into a bar and getting a drink for free, but it had to be served in a bedpan. For those of you too young to remember, before toilets, at night, you just duked and whizzed into a special bedpan, and then when it was full, you just tucked it under your bed as a kind of an air freshener, I guess. They died from drinking raw, high-proof, undiluted booze. That first swallow of the free hooch would have been a shock. I'm not saying high-proof, undiluted alcohol would automatically blind anyone who supped from it, but I'm not saying that either. Now, thanks to the fire brigade and the police and the soldiers, not one single person actually died from the fire, or smoke, or burns. No one was even trampled in the evacuation. No. Of all of the people who died on this day, every single one of them had been poisoned. They died from drinking raw, high-proof, undiluted booze. They were probably expecting a mellow burn, but this stuff must have burned and clawed and peeled the linings from their throats. It must have gone down like paint thinner. Some doubled over, retching, grabbing their skulls, which would have been spinning out of control, and collapsed from nausea. It's hard to explain how badly you f***ed up when you're slurring your speech at 1/15th the normal speed, and it's hard to puke your troubles away after your respiratory and pulmonary systems have collapsed. Don't even get me started on their livers and other organs. A man named McGrain said nearly everyone was trying it before suddenly falling down and becoming insensible. People were found collapsed in alleyways and tenements, overcome from the effects of the toxic, impure liquor mixed with debris, soot, and, of course, all that aforementioned mammalian bio-waste. Dozens were dragged to the hospital after almost immediately falling into profound comas, and some recovered, others did not. Of the 5,000 barrels of liquor, 61 were recovered, and some went missing under suspicious circumstances. They say that 6 men were trying to roll the barrels down the street. They were arrested in a beastly state of intoxication. Tightly packed tenement buildings on Mill Street, Ardee Street, Chambers Street, and Cork Street were destroyed along with nearby businesses, and many families were displaced. Could have been worse though. At least you didn't have to cope with delirium tremens Cujo. Of all the beasts that lapped from the liquid chaos, at the home of William Eyre, a dog appeared at his address, kicked in his door, staggering and drooling and foaming at the mouth. Cujo was tipsy. And to clarify, the appropriate amount of alcohol for a dog is supposed to be 0. And the appropriate outcome should have seen the dog outside adding to the vomit on the Eyre's property before collapsing dead. Instead, it burst into his house, possessed by high-octane zoomies, tearing around his home, destroying every piece of furniture it touched before lunging at Mr. Eyre in an attempt to saw his head off with its teeth. Mr. Eyre managed to clonk it with an iron bar, which it barely noticed, but it did change tact and now ran upstairs, tearing around from room to room, destroying every possession Eyre owned as robustly as any fire could have, before finally throwing itself and bursting through a window and ending its rampage in a heap on the road below. Property damage was extensive, both from the dog and the fire, but I'm specifically going back to the fire now. Numerous buildings and homes were scorched or destroyed, but the real toll is always the human cost. Dozens were admitted to hospitals, like we said, and at least 13 people died. And it was amazing that the death toll wasn't higher. The Lord Mayor Peter Paul McSwiney said that these deaths would have probably happened in any city where there was a tendency to indulge immoderately in drink, and went on to say, in the present case, the unfortunate victims apparently could not restrain themselves, as I understand, from the burning fluid. So, what happened? Well, when I ask listeners what their favorite kind of disasters are, some like nautical or aquatic disasters, and others really appreciate engineering or structural failures. Well, raise a glass, because these are kinda both. In both events, the disaster was triggered by the sudden failure of containers that proved dangerous because of the nature of the liquid they held or just the sheer volume of it. Both happened in densely packed urban neighborhoods constructed from stone and feces, where one was bombarded by an overwhelming tsunami of fluid while the other faced trickling fingers of living, spreading flame. In London, 8 people died, mostly women and children, from drowning or crushing. In Dublin, at least 13 people died, all men, all with whiskey on their breath, all fatally intoxicated. Both disasters drew big crowds, and both had legacies of municipal reforms and lived in local memory for years as tales of bizarre, almost surreal misfortune. In St. Giles' case, we're talking about some of the largest brewing vats in the world at the time, which is ambitious and awesome, as long as your middle name is Maintenance, which it was not. The vat's metal hoops had been weakened by age and the pressure of the contents before giving away. In the days that followed, the stench of spilled beer filled the air as residents cleared debris and searched for missing loved ones. Both the warehouse and the brewery were criticized out the wazoo for the poor state of their equipment, and of course there were lawsuits. However, if you have listened to this show at all, you know that justice can be fickle and not easily understood in practice. The courts ruled that the whole thing was an act of God, so that was that. No damages were owed. Now, if a company destroyed my home and a court told me it was okay because it was the will of Bakrazog, I would be pissed. If it helps at all, the Mew brothers were financially crippled by the loss. Well, at least until Parliament granted them tax relief for all the lost beer, which allowed them to recover. Following the disaster, London's breweries began replacing their enormous wooden vats with steel and concrete tanks. In the case of the Dublin warehouse, they couldn't determine a cause for the fire, like we said, so fault and blame shifted to the victims, who were solidly ridiculed in the press as early Darwin Award winners. London was treated as an industrial accident, Dublin was treated as a moral failing. Even the church went along with it. They said the true danger here was unbridled thirst, not actual fire, and I'll give them partial credit. Malone's warehouse was nearly ruined, and damages ran into the thousands of pounds, which would be millions today. The distillery operators were criticized for safety oversights, but no criminal charges were ever laid. Like the Mews, the Malones were seen as victims. The fire was ruled an accident, and again, that was that. And of all the fires that Dublin had ever seen to this point, this one stood out as one of the worst. They very nearly passed a law banning makeshift cups, but instead, they modernized fire safety and regulations, and they improved handling standards, so there was a silver lining. Who would have ever thought that alcohol, life's celebratory spirit, could have become an agent of such chaos and destruction? These disasters really put a spotlight on a world where ambition outpaced public and industrial safety. It also illustrated quite clearly how no one eats more than the poor, who were left to pick up the shattered pieces of their lives. It's a common story throughout history and around the world. The poor live lives of quiet desperation, eking out an existence in the shadow of their social betters without ever earning a second thought. Cast aside and coated in a sheen of waste products before a cleansing wave of alcohol came and washed them all away. Now, I want you to hold up a number of fingers, and if you can't count them or remember how many fingers you were using in the first place, I want you to start drinking water immediately and roll over onto your side. I knew this was going to be a terrible idea, and that's why I switched it to a sipping game before we even began. We mentioned different kinds of human and animal biowaste in all of its many forms over 1,100 times in this episode, and as someone who walked away from drinking, it's easy for me to both spank and empathize with anyone who did not play by the rules. The people of the 1800s United Kingdom knew disaster pretty well. They always were having fires and industrial accidents and outbreaks of disease all the time. But the people of the United Kingdom, even standing ankle deep in horse cakes, as always met horror with grit and humor. Real stiff upper lip kind of behavior, even in their poorest members. It's admirable as hell, and no doubt owed to the centuries of people surviving plague after war, after calamity, after catastrophe, after you name it. It all became part of their culture, in the way that the Canadian spirit's thought of as polite cooperation, and the American spirit is shut up, you don't know me, I'll do what I want. The British spirit is keep calm and carry on. They rescued each other, they mourned each other, and they shared their tales of woe, usually with a glass of something dark or bubbly or vaguely flammable in their hands. If you're still conscious and able to cobble together coherent thought and want to add me to your will as a small thanks for all the laughs and vomit, Well, honestly, I don't think you're going to live long enough to do that, as whatever part of your brain that had that thought is probably dying. But did you know the best way to help the show is actually to share the show? I'm serious about that. The more the show grows, the more likely we'll eventually find a good life insurance or funeral home sponsor so we can stop with all of these automated ads, and I apologize for them. I have zero control over them. If you're sick of them, in the meanwhile, you can always find our episodes ad-free on Patreon at patreon.com/funeralkazoo. And I made a post online recently that most of you would have missed, pointing out that the vast majority of Patreon supporters just sign up, make a monthly donation to help keep the show they love going, and that's it. They never log in, they don't answer emails, they don't care about extra content or talking with me or none of it. And I want everyone to know that I understand and I get it. You will never meet anyone happier to just let people be than me. If anyone is afraid that joining the Patreon means that they're getting dragged into a party bus where they have to kumbaya in a dance circle and put themselves out there in any kind of a way, please let me dispel you of that notion right now. Like 50% of the world's population, I too am an introvert. And like you, when my role in any kind of social obligation gets reduced or cancelled, the feeling that washes over me, I'm assuming, is what heroin users must feel. Let me just say, as a quiet one, or a loner, or an introvert, you are well outside the blast radius of any kind of obligatory behavior there. I love all my followers, free, paid, comatose, whatever. And failing that, you can always just visit buymeacoffee.com/doomsday and show your support with a one-time donation. And now I'd like to make a quick but heartfelt shout out to Scott Niedermeyer, Cynthia Engel, Mallory Barr, and Denise, or Dennis. I actually completely forgot to ask. The point being, I thank them for helping support me on Patreon. Again, as always, there is no show without you guys. You can reach out to me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook as Doomsday Podcast, or fire us an email to doomsdaypod@gmail.com. Older episodes can be found wherever you found this one, and while you're there, please leave us a review and tell your friends. Leave us a review and tell your friends. And I always thank my Patreon listeners, new and old, for their support and encouragement, but if you can spare the money and had to choose, I always ask you to consider making a donation to Global Medic. Global Medic is a rapid response agency of Canadian volunteers offering assistance around the world to aid in the aftermath of disasters and crises. They're often the first and sometimes the only team to get critical interventions to people in life-threatening situations, and to date they have helped over 6 million people across 89 different countries. You can learn more and donate at globalmedic.ca. On the next episode, I am doing a special thank you-sode for one special listener who says her favorite episodes include human crushes, plane disasters, difficult situations, and survival against the odds. Now, if she had mentioned cannibalism, we would have a perfect quinfecta of checked boxes on our hands. I mean, it's not going to be a human crush story per se, but a lot of people will get crushed, and some are going to get chewed. It's the Flight 571 air disaster of 1972. We'll talk soon. Safety goggles off, and thanks for listening.